My, Iris, you are the biggest horse I have ever seen. So yes, this beautiful horse right behind me is Iris. She might be the largest horse I've ever seen in person. She's a Belgian draft horse, which means she's used for a lot of good farm work and pulling. Eventually she's going to be trained to pull a sleigh or a carriage. She actually doesn't belong to me. She belongs to my buddy Tom. Tom's on vacation this week, and so all this week I'm taking care of his farm and doing his chores, which I got to admit I'm kind of enjoying, just because it's an opportunity to work with some very different animals than what I usually have. I mean, but look at that. She is an absolute unit. Iris here is a little over 18 hands tall, which is, I guess, the unit of measurement used to measure horses, which I guess amounts to be about 6'2". And I believe when you're measuring a horse, you're measuring up to their body. Because I'm like 5'9", and she's definitely got a couple of inches on me. She weighs roughly 2,300 pounds, which is more than double the weight of one of my cattle. Her feet are so large that she needs to have custom-made shoes. Like, you can't just buy them right off the rack. And while I would never consider myself a horse person, I just might be falling in love with Iris here. You know, in terms of caring for her, it involves mucking out her stall and making sure she has fresh hay and making sure she has fresh water. I mean, obviously there's a lot more that goes into owning an animal like Iris, and it can't be cheap, and it's not cheap to buy an animal like Iris, but that said, it is pretty cool. And you know, one of the questions I get the most on our YouTube channel and like whenever I do a live stream is what animals we plan to add next to our farm. And while I love a horse like Iris, I don't intend to add horses to the farm. But there are some other animals that Tom has here that I'm seriously thinking about. Like, I don't know if you can see it behind me, but Tom has about 8 Scottish Highland cattle, which are very similar to my Scottish Highland cattle. In fact, some of them are actually related.
Sisters, there were never such devoted sisters.
In fact, I think Tom's herd of Scottish Highland cattle was one of the things that motivated me to go with that breed specifically. They're just really well suited for our area here. Tom's farm isn't too far from my farm. It's, I don't know, maybe about a 10-minute drive just on the other side of town here in Peacham. You know, about 2 years ago, one of Tom's cattle actually escaped. And so I tried to help him find it. We used a drone, and that steer was gone for, I don't know, darn near a month before it eventually got found by an elderly one-armed man who's an archery expert. It's a really weird story, but I ended up making a video about it that you should watch. Tom manages his Highland cattle a little bit different than I do. He keeps them in paddocks, and then he'll rotate them. You'll notice here that he's got a couple of different paddocks that he'll rotate the cattle in through. I think on the upside, that's a lot less work for the farmer. I think on the downside, I actually think it's less efficient from how much ground you get out of grazing the animals. Because Tom went away for vacation, he actually even fed them a couple of bales of hay that you can see out there in the pasture. Of course, for me, the farm sitter, it makes my job really easy. All I have to do is check and make sure that they have water. Yep, they have water. And make sure that their fence is hot. Yep, their fence is hot. So that part of the job is pretty simple. By the way, if you like this t-shirt I'm wearing, it's available for sale right down below, only for a limited time. Take advantage of the sale now, because once it goes to press, you won't be able to buy it anymore. It's available both in the blue that I'm wearing as well as black. All right, let's check on the next group of animals here. Looks like they're a little light on hay. Hey, sheepy, sheepy, sheepies. So yeah, Tom actually has a small flock of sheep. You can see him here. I think the breed is mostly Scottish blackface. How's it going, guys? You know, I actually took my wife over here the other day, and she absolutely fell in love with these little guys. I think if you were gonna ask Allison what her next farm animal she'd want on the farm would be, it would most definitely be sheep. You know, again, these sheep have basically a yard that's here. They also have a couple of other paddocks that they rotationally graze that you can see down there. Hey there, buddy. You wanna say hi? Oh, you're a sweetheart, aren't you? Trying to suckle on my fingers? Yeah. Yeah, they're super friendly. They're very used to being handled. Some of them are a little bit more skittish though. Run away! So you can see, like, here's a paddock here. Tom uses like the sheep netting that you can get from various agricultural supplies places. Whether it be somebody like Gallagher or somebody like Premier One, they've got it kind of available. You can buy those pretty easily. And so Tom will rotate them around here. You know, if you look at this farm, right? It's a mixture of cattle yards, hay fields, and grazing. And sometimes they'll mix them up too so that you get the benefit of fertilizing from the animals, but then you can also cut it and store that hay for later because, you know, again, here in Vermont, for cattle, sheep, horses, you've got to feed hay roughly 6 months a year. And I know that there's some folks who would talk about stockpiling, but unfortunately, when it comes to our winters, There's just too much snow on the ground for that to be possible. I will admit that the idea of owning sheep appeals to me. I really love grazing herbivores, you know. It's why I've loved having the cattle so much. Even geese, you could argue, are kind of in a similar ilk, even though that they digest slightly differently. In fact, sometimes I even think about grazing my cattle with my sheep in what's known as a flurd, you know, a combination of a flock and a herd. What you can also do is send the sheep in behind the cattle, like say a couple weeks later, because the parasites that affect my cattle wouldn't affect the sheep and vice versa. And so right now I rest my ground for about 60 days between when my cattle graze. With these sheep, I could like rest it for 30 days, let the sheep come in, eat, and then rest it another 30 days, and then send the cattle back on in. Arguably from a grazing standpoint, that could be the best possible recipe. The downside though I see with sheep is they are super susceptible to parasites. And so in particular, as we have these long winters, I'd have to keep them in the barn somewhere, and they'd have a yard, and I'd have to be constantly watching for parasites. And again, if I want to raise them naturally like I raise my cattle, it'd be extremely hard to do it and do it well without having casualties occasionally. But I don't know. I could see someday getting not a huge flock of sheep, but some sheep. It'd be nice to have them. I really love how docile they are. They're so easy to manage, particularly relative to the cattle. You know, with the cattle, I'm always worried that I could get knocked out by one of their horn swings. With the sheep, I really just don't have that risk. I don't know, maybe someday. But I will say that the animal I do intend to add to the farm in the very near future is also here on the farm. And that animal is these guys right here. Hello, little guys, how's it going? Hey, piggies, I can pick piggies. They're so curious about the camera. They're like, what is that thing? So yeah, Tom has 6 feeder pigs. So these are hybrids. Gosh, I'm even drawing a blank on exactly the breed. Spotsworth maybe. You know, unlike my buddy Zach who breeds pigs, these guys are relatively modest in size. You know, they came to Tom's farm at about 8 weeks old, and they will stay here till they get, I don't know, maybe about twice the size that they are right now. And then they go off to the processor so that they end up in the freezer. So it's a relatively short window that they spend on the farm. You don't have to deal with any winter chores or winter pig activities. And you can see here, Tom's got this little pig sty or little pig yard set up. He's got electric fencing that's down low to keep them from trying to push through this harder fencing. This fence actually right here serves as both a barrier for the sheep as well as the pigs. But then they also have this little interior space, which is where you can find their feeder and their little nipple drinker right there. Don't try to bite my fingers, buddy. Now these pigs are definitely hungry, so let's feed them. It's always kind of a mad scrum when they first get fed. And you'll see that the more dominant ones will push their way ahead to try to get the feed from the other ones. It's okay, there's plenty for everybody, guys. It's okay. So as far as feed that you can give them, it's basically like a swine grower is typically what people will use. You know, it's available at any feed store. It's a combination of corn and soybean and some grains. What's also really cool about doing pigs is you can feed them a whole bunch of other stuff. You know, like pigs are the ultimate composters. Right now, about half of our compost goes to our chickens. The other half ends up in our compost pile. With the pigs, probably about 95% of our compost would end up in the pig trough. And even when I think about having things like leftover eggs, that's a great way to turn waste product into things like sausage and bacon. And so having a couple of pigs on the farm would make sense from that perspective as well. You know, like for example, right now we're in the depths of zucchini season. I would love to pawn off some of that zucchini on these guys. And so it's very much my intention that when we get to roughly April, May of next year, we will add a couple of pigs to the farm. Somewhere between 2 and 4, I would say. I don't want to go too crazy, but I also know that the effort it takes to raise 2 pigs is not that much different than it takes to raise 3 or 4 pigs. And so you'll find me doing something around that. I'm still not exactly sure what type of breed we'll do for our farm. You know, I could in theory do very similar pigs to what Tom has here. Or you could see me getting a fancier breed like the Mangalitsa. I think the upside to a breed like this is they would mature before winter, and that makes it much easier to own them. If I got like a Mangalitsa, I think they take like 18 months to mature, and so I'd have to do a winter with the pigs as well. Quite frankly, I'm not sure I'd want to do, particularly the first time around. You know, when people do ask me that question of what animal we're adding next to the farm, it's often just in the name of, well, I want to see something different, I want to see something new. But if you're that farmer, you're that homesteader who has to have that animal, you really do have to educate yourself on some of the basics related to that animal. You have to get the right infrastructure so you're set up to take care of that animal. It's actually a more serious decision than I think sometimes people take. That's not to say you're not going to learn a whole lot once the animal ends up on your farm, but I guess my point is simply that you should do some work to prep so that when it is time for that animal to end up on your farm, the learning curve is a little less steep. Good girl, Iris. Good girl. You're so nice. Yes, you are.